Ex- Perfect. I wanted to wait to make sure this is got it. Great. Well, I'm overjoyed about this seminar. I was talking to my wife about it this morning, and it's just like, um, we have a group of four amazing people, superstars, who are going to be presenting. I'm terrible with introductions, so I'm going to just ask if you don't mind to just introduce yourselves. Can we go around and
Yeah.
do you want to start, Mike?
Yeah, great. My name is Mike Dean. I'm the executive director of a nonprofit in Minnesota called the North Star Prosperity. We're working to build a more inclusive economy. But for the last 20 years, I've been at the intersection of civic engagement and higher ed. So I've been working to engage young people to be more civically engaged, mainly in Minnesota, but also part of a national effort called the Students Learn, Students Vote Coalition, to really engage people then nationally too. That's what the Emma.
Thanks for having us. My name is Emma Burns, and I am from Northern Arizona of Flagstaff, and I'm the Arizona State Coordinator for Campus Vote Project. And we work to help students get accurate information about voting on their campuses and how to navigate that process because it's super complicated. And then we work with administrators at all of those schools in Arizona to help them build a more voter-friendly campus so that they're able to give students accurate information and help folks in their communities learn a little bit more about participating in the civic process. And I'll pass it to Sophie.
Hey everyone, my name is Sophie. I am the deputy coordinator in Arizona, helping Emma out over there. I am located near the ASU area, if anyone knows it. I was previously a democracy fellow at ASU for a couple semesters before coming on as a deputy. And yeah, it's been a really good time working this election season.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Mike Burns, he, him. And yeah, I work at the Fair Election Center with and Sophia, directing our campus vote project. And as I was saying before, I've been at this for about 10 years now. So it's changed a lot, but I feel like we're still at an intersection where it's going to be really important going forward to do this type of work. So appreciate you having us.
Great. No, we're very lucky to have you all.
We kick things off. Perfect. Well, thank you very much for having us today. We're really going to focus in on this topic of, how do we engage students to be actively engaged citizens in our democracy? We just finished up the election here, and so now it's a good time to sort of debrief and reflect, and then think about kind of where do we go from here. And I want to kind of start out with this question, and we're going to kind of walk through kind of a strategy that we've sort of developed that's worked in both Minnesota, Arizona. We'll kind of walk through it at a high level and then dive into a case study for both Minnesota and Arizona, and then end with some research questions that we'd love to kind of pose to you all to help us kind of think about the effectiveness of this type of strategy. And I think it can have an impact on both not only democracy work, but also public health work and engagement. I've used some of the same strategies to actually engage folks in upticks in COVID vaccination rates in the state of Minnesota. And so I think there's some application that could be used in many different fields. And I know that elections in a lot of our minds right now, especially from a public health lens, elections have consequences, and we have a new HHS nominee, which I think will pose some interesting challenges to public health. It also is going to present some interesting challenges, I think, to democracy in general. And so to kind of kick things off is how would our politics really change if we had full participation of college students in our democracy? And would the election outcome have been different had we seen a huge uptake? And just kind of a case studies that it is possible. Actually, in the state of Minnesota, we have a college called St. Olaf College that in 2020 had 87.6% of its students vote, according to data from the National Study for Learning, Voting, Engagement. And so a lot of people say, oh, young people voting, they're just apathetic, they're not interested. But here you can see a college that actually has got almost there with full participation. And so we believe it is possible, but we just have to figure out exactly what are those best practices that really sort of drive that. Particularly at St. Olaf College, they use some of the same strategies we're talking about here. And that's class reps. They do peer-to-peer engagement. In fact, they hire 100 students to go out and do this work for the entire semester. And you see sort of a huge uptick. And in Minnesota in general tends to sort of be a leader when you see civic engagement voting rates. And so many of our public colleges are in the 70 to 80% of students are sort of voting in that presidential year. And 2020 was a high year, a high watermark, I would say, for voting. We've seen that as kind of a reflection in the last few weeks as they've sort of analyzed the election results from 2024, that youth voting did go down. But we really want to kind of dive into this and really think about ways that we can engage folks. So I'm going to actually pass it over to Mike Burns to kind of set up some of these. Yeah, we can go to the next slide. Then to kind of give us kind of a high level view of some of these issues in the civic landscape.
Yeah, I think we thought it might be helpful to do some level setting of kind of like who is today's college student, and then kind of what are some of the issues we see and trying to welcome them into our democracy. So I think part of the concern we have is obviously, if folks are unaware, like we have a closed system in this country. You have to be registered to be able to vote. And some states have kind of figured out ways to do online registration, same day registration, election day registration that reduce those barriers. But there are a number of states that gone in the opposite direction, usually for political reasons, that have made it harder and harder to register or to be eligible to vote. One of the things here that Emma pulled out for us, which is really great, is this report about, you can kind of see here, I think if folks are hopefully able to read all of that. It's just, this is from the, I'm terrible at the acronym, but this is the Community College Association, the AT.
It's like teacher one.
Oh, okay, yeah. But one of the things was like most students didn't know who the president of the US Senate was. Almost a third of students think that senators serve a 4-year term when they serve a 6-year term, just so we're all on the same page. More than 1/3 of students are kind of unsure who the Speaker of the House of Representatives is. So I feel like we see a lot of time and attention and energy always spent on the presidential race. But frequently, even just getting down to the rest of the federal ballot, we see a real gap in kind of civic knowledge and education, even when you start to get into folks who are kind of like in the beginning of their collegiate careers, much less trying to get folks all the way down the ballot in state and local races and some of those local issues. So I think there's a bit of a gap even just on kind of the knowledge end of it. And then I think we'll go and talk a little bit about the process, or, should I sit here? Great. So one of the things we do see too, though, is even when we talk to folks about why they didn't vote again, one of the key barriers that we see folks say is, like, I think sometimes we talk about apathy, but lots of times what we actually see is there's a chunk of people who say they didn't think it would make a difference or wouldn't matter. I actually think a lot of that is structural too. Like, we use the Electoral College and the US Senate, which distribute political power based on geography instead of population, and divorces it from people's actual lived life. And then you start to gerrymander those districts, or we haven't added members to the US House of Representatives in over 100 years. So even the House of Representatives, which gets reapportioned every 10 years with the census, is still getting more and more out of sync with population trends, because every state is guaranteed at least 2 senators and 1 House member. So we see this real imbalance in the political structures, especially at the federal level, in a lot of ways. So I think even a lot of that, I don't think it would have mattered. I think you see people who might feel like they're not part of the majority and they're like perceived majority in their local community. So then they don't even think voting is important, not so much that they don't think voting in general is important. But then the majority of the pie graph is actually a lot of other things. Folks who said, I forgot, or I was too busy. A lot of things around, they actually tried to vote, but they had a problem either with absentee ballots, which is something we've heard more and more actually since the pandemic. I feel like that number has been going up as we've seen the popularity and people's familiarity with that start to be more common. But then we heard a lot of questions from students, especially students that travel out of state but are trying to vote back at a home address. There are a couple like Georgia and Texas were particularly terrible at this year. So we'd hear from students in other states attending college who requested absentee ballots, never got them, or got them so late that they weren't able to return them by the deadlines. And we've seen a number of those states like Texas and Georgia shortening the window for when you can request your ballot and when it has to be received back by. So some of those types of issues where folks said I didn't have enough information or I had an issue with the problem that we think also kind of need to be tackled in this place and these ways. And then again, just to kind of note, this is from something that we Mike had mentioned already. The National Study of Learning, Voting, and Engagement is an amazing study that I think has over 1,000 institutions that participated in it across the country. And they do a very unique thing. They actually use like a collected up like data file from all 50 states, and they work with the National Clearinghouse. They get authorization from the campuses, but then they have the clearinghouse compare the student records of an institution against that voter file so that they can identify students from any state, so that you're capturing not just students that might vote in a local precinct by looking at the surrounding area, but actually looking to see if students are voting somewhere else back to like a home address. They're still capturing those folks, even if they're not voting like directly at the precinct that might be located next to a residential institution. So some really great data that they're able to provide. And just wanted to sort of note, like we said, 2020, amazingly high historic year, highest turnout we've ever seen in the country. But also we saw young people and then students in particular, like college students, voting at such a high increase that they were actually outpacing the increase with older cohorts. So we saw that kind of traditional gap between younger and older voters actually close. We saw that be the case actually in the 2016 election as well, and the 2018 election in that midterm. We were on a bit of an upcrease in youth turnout to 2020, and we saw this huge turnout, and it stair-stepped down a little bit from the data we have so far. So in 2022, we can see it came back down a little bit, still the second highest turnout we've ever seen in a midterm, pretty up close to where we see about a third of students kind of voting is, I think, pretty normal. That's what we saw in 2018 as well, which was a kind of, I think, hopefully what the new norm will be around here. And we don't have, this data lags a lot because we need to wait for everything to get certified and then for them to run this. So it'll be much later next year before we have this for college students in particular. But there's another organization, Circle, that does some research on this, and they, based on the exit polls, they have broken out youth turnout already. And it looks like that is down some as well, more around like the 42% turnout rate, which is down from the,
It's 53 to 55.
yeah, sorry, I'm off by 10% there. Yeah, it's 53 as opposed to, it was 10 points higher in 2020, but that is basically back in line more with like the 2016 electorate, where we see that number kind of being at that elevated rate. And actually within the battleground states, we're still seeing it be a little bit higher. And we know normally the college student vote rate is a little bit higher than youth in general. So I think once we see the rest of that data come together, we'll kind of see these different pockets. And this is just like in the aggregate, like what are the big trends? But a lot of this looks very different kind of state by state. And election by election, when you start to take into account like the competitiveness of elections that are going on there. Was there a Senate race as well in a state, kind of down ballot from even in a presidential year, that might make a state have higher turnout when folks are starting to plug more into those types of things. So hopefully that's just like some helpful ground setting of kind of like where we're at currently with student voters and their civic knowledge.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. So Mike kind of gave us the lay of the landscape right now. And obviously, right now, this last election, we're that 53 to 55% sort of nationally voting rate. I think our hope is that's not good enough. And so we really want to see that full participation, because that question that I posed at the beginning is, what would our democracy look like and how would it be different from a policy perspective if we had that full participation? So one of the things that we are working on is really thinking about engaging students in the classroom for this voter engagement activity. And this really works for a few reasons. One is, I think, particularly at colleges and universities, they're really a great place for young people who are, again, just graduating from high school, coming into college and building that identity, both as an adult, but then also building that identity as a citizen in our community. And so it's really critical to sort of engage them in this sort of voting process. Also, as we mentioned earlier too, is that we've seen this sort of declining participation among sort of civic education in our K-12 community. And so it's really important for higher ed to fill that gap, to help students understand really what their role is as a citizen. And so as part of that, we've built this strategy of really engaging them inside the classroom and using those discussions and active engagement to really help them understand some of the processes that Mike had mentioned. That's a real barrier for them, but then also to kind of create those behaviors to vote and sort of get motivated. And we think particularly classrooms are effective because students are engaged, right? So they're conditioned to really come in and try to pay attention and learn, and it creates that sort of safe space of engagement that maybe doesn't always exist in other places. The traditional tactic that people often use for voter engagement is tabling. So they'll like sit outside a mess hall or the cafeteria or just in a student union and try to engage folks. And that is not really a conducive learning environment, quite honestly. It's hard to have an in-depth conversation. It's hard for folks to be inquisitive like they maybe are in a classroom. And so we really feel this is an effective space to do that. So we've started to build a strategy around that, which we call sort of class wraps. And then here's again some of the challenges that we're facing around that civic education, that 42% of adults feel that they're not getting that sort of civics taught to them. And that's from a Harvard poll that was done actually this spring. And then 41% of them believe that their voting doesn't make a difference. So these are those challenges. And then even inside higher ed, found that 8% of faculty want to encourage voting, but only 30% of them are actually discussing those elections inside the classroom. So a real gap in sort of how this is happening. And that's some of the challenges that we're trying to address. So what are some of the lessons learned? So we weren't the first people to do this. And this issue has actually been studied in the past. So back in 2006, they did a classroom voter registration experiment, exploring both faculty and peer-to-peer, so student to student. In that study, they did see a 6% increase in voter registration rates, and then also a 2.6% increase in voting rates as a result. There was a similar type of study done at the high school level, and there we saw actually even greater impact when it came to sort of turnout. And that was done not too long ago, back in 2018. So that's kind of the lit review that we have so far, but it's actually pretty light in terms of the literature that's out there, sort of in this particular area. So some of the practices that we've used around this voter engagement is really about using what we call sort of a structured class wrap. And you'll see between my case study in Minnesota and Emma's in Arizona is that there are different styles on how you can do this. Mine are very much sort of a quick 5-minute sort of literally call it a wrap because it's so quick and short. Emma is able to get the whole classroom. And so that actually presents sort of different opportunities that could be assessed and learned from around that. So you get the full 55 minutes or 75 minutes to really kind of take them through a civic journey. I'm often only given 5 minutes because that's what faculty will give me, and I will take what I can get when it comes to this. But we have huge numbers around this. Then as part of that, also just focus on really making this process relevant to the students' lives. So we try to connect them to, if we're talking to a political science class versus a science class versus a math class or public health class, we will sort of condition kind of how we describe some of these issues to try to make it relevant. And that tends to have an impact. And then also providing immediate opportunities for action. So oftentimes we will do what's called a pledge card. So a student will actually develop an intention saying, I plan to vote in the upcoming election, and making them a commitment to themselves. Studies have actually shown on that actually will boost turnout by making that sort of intention. So having that action and having fill it out there in the classroom can really have an impact. And then we also do voter registration forms as another component of this then too. So with this, why this sort of works is that we really sort of develop a systematic approach to that engagement. And I'll get into that a little bit. We know from behavioral psychology that really using that targeted time inside the classroom for the sort of voting action, really increases that engagement, but then also exploring ways to have that high quality class wrap can really leverage the student attention effectively as part of this. And so the other key component of this is we really see faculty as sort of civic stewards, no matter sort of what area that they teach, because you're really sort of trusted messengers because, again, you sort of command the attention of the students. You may not feel that always when you're up there, but I think there is that sort of respect, and it's a great way to sort of engage them in this academic perspective. It's also really moving from that passive support, which is what most candidates and campaigns do, to really that active engagement where you sort of have that attention of the audience. And then we're working to really build in that faculty buy-in sort of through this process by sort of helping them understand what we're presenting, providing with resources and support along the way is really a critical step. So with this, I'll kind of talk through a little bit of the case study that we have here in Minnesota. And I hope you like my sign there. It's just, again, that's the thing with doing student work is it's opportunity to be creative and funny and entertaining. And so I'm a Gen Xer, so I'm a little bit old for this group, but it's kind of the nice things that we sort of do as part of this. So at the University of Minnesota, this was the second cycle in a row that we had done this activity, where essentially what we did is a very large scale email engagement campaign to faculty, where we sent out a message to literally every faculty member on campus. So roughly that was 2,300 faculty, and asked them, can we come in and deliver a 5-minute presentation to your classroom? It was very short, very sweet, very direct ask. And roughly this cycle, 1,000 faculty responded yes. So we had roughly a 1 in 3 sort of response rate, which we have been pleasantly surprised by, and actually is more than we can handle because there's just a lot of back-end administration that needs to happen. I mean, we're talking about literally responding to 1,000 email messages. Getting volunteers set up to do that is quite a logistical hurdle. We recruited over 50 students to essentially deliver those class wraps then throughout a 3-week period. So as part of that, we went and delivered 1,000 class wraps. We had 13,000 students sign pledge cards and 2,000 students registered to vote. So we tabulate at the end, we expect that we actually hit every student at the University of Minnesota during those 3-week period. So it's roughly a campus of 40,000 students. And so, we roughly had almost 1 out of 4 students fill out an intention to vote card. And so we're really happy with those numbers. I mean, that's just a huge sort of undertaking. And I think it comes down to a variety of things. Is one, this is just a strategy that works because we're in there as a trusted messenger. We know that there are other groups that try to engage students, but don't have as much success because they're not using sort of this trusted messenger setting. And so it's that mix of being in the classroom, having the sort of permission of the faculty to do it, and then 2, being a student themselves, that really is what drives kind of the effectiveness of this. I think what we're interested in exploring is how many of those students that develop the intention to vote did they actually vote, and how many students that did not get the this sort of trial, what was their, did they not turn, were they less likely to turn out sort of as a result of this? And so this was, I think a really interesting example. I think the difference between this is that we went very broad with this. So this does require a fair amount of systems and operations sort of behind it to do this effectively. We came in there with just these 5-minute sort of class wraps where we kind of went in, explained why voting is important, addressed some of the logistical hurdles that Mike talked about, how you register to vote, those sorts of pieces, and then we were in and out sort of very quickly. Emma's going to talk a little bit about sort of a slightly different approach. And I think that's the other thing we'd love to explore is there a difference between how much time you get in the classroom in terms of the students' likelihood for voting, and then what's that long-term impact too? Because we have to remember that these are often first-time voters, being 18 to 20-year-olds. And so with this, how does this impact not only the next election, but does this impact then future elections then down the road? Because we made that first voting experience a positive one where we kind of help them overcome some of those hurdles. And the last piece I want to show is here's our intention card too that we use. So we worked with some civic design folks to sort of build this to really be intentional about just capturing very short basic information, but then helping students kind of work through their voting plan about checking to make sure that they're registered, identifying whether they're going to vote early or on election day, and then confirm their voting location if they were going to vote on election day and where they vote. And then we sent follow-up messages to them as part of this to help do reminders as part of this process. So that's kind of sort of what we do. I'm going to pass it over to Emma to talk a little bit through kind of what they did at Arizona.
Awesome. So yeah, thank you, Mike. We're so excited to start running this program in Arizona. Thank you. Because in the state of Arizona, to vote is a great privilege because it's really hard to register. It's hard to know accurate information, especially when laws change so frequently. So when we sought out to do this program in the state of Arizona, we wanted to do accurate information from a trusted messenger in classrooms. We tried to replicate what happened with Mike Dean in Minnesota, but as we now know, very incredibly different landscapes regarding voting. And from what we've spoken to a number of institutions to talk about voting in any way, even if it's completely nonpartisan, trying to expand the electorate, trying to register more folks is inherently partisan in the state of Arizona, is what we were told by different institutions. At some of the most seemingly empowering of students organizations, the campuses that we have, threatening messages were sent out to instructors at those institutions prior to the election, leaving out things that you're allowed to do as an instructor, threatening fines, threatening folks' jobs, if you're engaging with elections in any way. Although the information here, that snippets of these emails sent, is accurate, they took out key pieces of what faculty members are allowed to do in an attempt to scare folks into not talking to their students about civic engagement. These threatening messages were sent. We're trying to navigate this landscape where this stuff is considered partisan. We would reach out to civic engagement directors, say, hey, like we have this program, we want to take your list, we want to give your students accurate, good information.
the civic engagement and government relations folks would say yes, and then it would be shot down by the provost office at every major institution in Arizona because it's considered too partisan, and they don't want to start getting into that space where they could receive backlash. So we started to see this, a few roadblocks happening in Arizona.
Can I ask?
Yeah.
Does that include public and private universities?
Yes.
It's the same thing?
Yeah, we saw this, we heard from community colleges were the ones that told us, well, some different community colleges in the state of Arizona were the folks that told us that engaging with vote work in any way is partisan and would be construed as that. And then this message is from one of the public institutions in Arizona, one of the 3 big colleges. So we're just seeing a lot of fear spread through all the faculty members. Yeah.
Really quick, just to be clear though, too, so that we're all on the same page. This is not partisan.
No,
It is
completely nonpartisan.
Political,
Yeah.
but the work we are doing is strictly nonpartisan. We are only trying to talk to students about how they get registered, how they vote. If we can, we try and give them information about what's on the ballot, but none of it is actual electioneering about
No.
encouraging folks to support or not support specific candidates or measures. So like that is I think what Emma's alluding to here is that like they are saying it is partisan because we were trying to engage them in the election, but none of what we are actually doing is partisan. It is nonpartisan work just around the election process.
Totally. And what we would hear from faculty members is I would go present to a classroom and I'd hang out outside to see what they say afterwards. And one faculty member said, I'm scared I will lose my job if I talk to you about registering to vote or I talk about civic engagement. So I brought in somebody to do it for us. And so that word of mouth would spread to other instructors and they'd email me and say, hey, I'm scared to talk about this. Can you come in and talk to my students for me? Because I'm scared. And a lot of faculty members that we spoke with, I spoke to a chemistry instructor who said, I don't want to lose my job. And my STEM students don't know any information about voting. And I'm scared that even if it's nonpartisan and I share it, I'll get reported and I could lose my job because it might be misinterpreted. And so that's where we come in. We want to be trusted messengers, provide this nonpartisan, completely basic information to students. And how we decided to do that, since we couldn't get the lists, is we got to work building the lists of different classes at these schools. And we targeted students based off of the likelihood of their major to turn out in elections. And so my big goal at these public universities was to talk to STEM students, folks in engineering and computer science and art. Those are the majors that are least likely to vote at this specific school in Northern Arizona. And so we reached out to those professors and we said, hey, here's the script that we'll use. Here's the information that we'll tell your students. Can we have 15 minutes of your time to come talk to folks and tell them about voting? We worked with some, yeah. If you are working like to change the election in some way, so you're like telling folks in a partisan way, this information, that is infringing on what you can do as a faculty member. But if you're staying nonpartisan, you are totally allowed to tell your students, here's how you register to vote. Here's your polling location. Like you're allowed to talk about politics. You just can't be trying to influence a student in one direction or the other.
And some of this is all state law.
Mhm.
So this is Arizona state law. So here in Maryland, I don't believe have laws like this, correct? But this law is even, I mean, I would say even in Arizona, you could endorse a candidate if you choose during your classroom, right? You're not trying to.
No, I mean, the tough thing was the statute that they sent around at the public institutions. No one wants to be the test case of like academic free speech versus the statute, but the statute basically says that like you can't use public resources to electioneer, and like, but the important part is like people don't understand the definition of like electioneering is the part where you're actually trying to influence someone's vote. But like even the statute that they were sending around, if you read the whole thing, it says like faculty can talk about this, like, and especially even like ballot initiatives and the issue impact. Like they tried to craft the statute in a way that says like you can still talk about the impact the elections have, even within a field of study, or talk about ballot initiatives and what they might do. But they didn't want people like taking public resources, and it's written more broadly too. Like they don't want you to use public resources to then influence the election. But in the hyper partisan and polarized kind of place that we find ourselves, especially in a state like Arizona, that has kind of tipped back and forth between the parties and has some real kooks involved on some sides of the election disputes there. There's this fear of intimidation and people not, I appreciate it, but like the people at the institution who are responsible for risk, like in the provost's office or in the general counsel's office, like their job is to mitigate risk for the institution. not to make sure that every student has their voice heard in the democracy. So like for them, it's easier to say like, we would really discourage you from talking about elections in any way in your classroom than to have the more nuanced conversation that we're even having here now about like what people can and can't do, and try and actually train faculty, in fact, to navigate that, and then potentially still have people kind of make very, like it's sort of what's happening in the election administration space too, where folks are just claiming that there's fraud, but it's led to a lot of intimidation and threats against election officials. I think we're starting to see some of that even in like the campus space with faculty and with institutions, where folks in bad faith are attacking those folks, saying they're doing things that they're not. But then to prove that you're not doing it, it puts you under a microscope. It puts people in literal jeopardy with some of the folks that are making these types of threats. So it's not a good situation to be in, unfortunately.
Election year or already.
Yeah, I think that one's a bit tougher because it's like, well, is it there's like a positionality, and like, are you doing it during class? Or are you just talking with students outside of class when you're sharing that? And like I said, I think there's some conflicting things going on here around like academic freedom and then like what some of these electioneering statutes say.
I mean, my take, not being, having no expertise in this, but just as a faculty member, is that the overall purpose of these class drafts is to provide valuable information to students. I think of it as a gift to students, to give them information on how to navigate the election process in terms of how do you register to vote, where do you go to vote, what are the deadlines, and things like that. Oh, I can get this.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, that's good. That's fine. So it's totally nonpartisan in the sense that no candidate is ever mentioned. That's which way you vote is not discussed in any way. It's just helping people to vote however they want to do it. So I think it's, from my perspective, quite clear that that's fine, totally fine, good thing to do.
Mhm.
And it's, so yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. We have tried to structure, and what we are focused on doing, we know is very far and on the acceptable side. There are some of the other scenarios that you were asking about and some other ways that folks might want to engage in classroom discussions that get a little bit more dicey, especially depending on the specific state and the state laws that they have.
I think you could help with
What?
that.
Yeah.
Browser, do you?
Sorry.
Oh, no, you're.
Oh, yeah, just get the share screen going again.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Thank you.
Gotcha. Let me get the camera.
But so with that being said, like a lot of our instructors were very wary of allowing anybody to come in their classrooms, especially because you can say you're nonpartisan. Like I can say anything in an email, but that doesn't mean I'll follow that when I go into a classroom. So when we sent out our emails to these faculty members, we'd say like, hey, I am an alumni of your institution. Here's our website. Here's exactly what we'll say. Here's the sources for our information. And this is why we want to come talk. And so we'd mention to those professors like, hey, you're a STEM professor and your students only voted 16% in the last election. So we want to like make this information accessible. When we give these presentations, though, we know there's a finite amount of time and there's a lot of information for students to learn. And so Sophie went and talked to students at these campuses to see what they needed to know. So I'll give it to Sophie.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we were interviewing some of these students, when we were piloting at campuses like Mesa Community College, we had ran into students just not having a great level of civic education and understanding of different things. One of the key differences was differences between primaries and general elections. A lot of people didn't know the differences between those. They didn't know the deadlines for when you had to register and all of the things that went along with that. How to use the mail-in ballot system. It changes pretty frequently depending on your state law and your local law. So a lot of people were just confused. I know at NAU they had changed a polling location last minute and hadn't told people. So different differences like that made it really hard for students to understand what was happening. And then, yeah, again, like where to vote, what to bring. The ID laws in Arizona have become more stringent. So even when we were doing election protection tabling across U of A and ASU and different places, a lot of students would come up and just not even know what they needed to go to the polling location with to actually vote. So that was a big difference too that needed to help. And then, yeah, how do you check your registration status? There are a lot of different websites these days that you can go through and they'll have ads and all these different kinds of things. So a lot of the students don't know that there's like an official state website where you can just go and get it without selling your information or anything like that. So that's a big thing as well. And then, yeah, just getting accurate information in general. A lot of students have been complaining about the misinformation and disinformation that's been happening this election cycle. So getting accurate information and nonpartisan information has been a really important factor.
Totally. And so given what Sophie learned from these students, we decided to craft a script that would contain accurate information that hit all these points in a way that's engaging to students. But what we needed to combat first was a need for trusted sources. This is an example of an email sent out by a county recorder's office saying that a third-party organization on this campus was giving students false information. Whether they knew it was false, did it in good faith, we don't know. But they were telling students, you can demand a provisional ballot and it will count in a county that you don't belong in. So that's what was presented to these students in their classroom presentations. This tells me that we really need centralized, accurate, good faith presentations that are signed onto by the school that have been verified that the information is correct. Because while in some states you can vote in a different county than what you live in, not how it works here in Arizona. So we were telling students you need to check which county you're registered in, you need to verify this information. And when we have good information, students are being told the right things in their classrooms, you see so many more happy folks at a polling location on election day. Because seeing students getting turned away because of this information, it's a failure that we can, by doing these classroom presentations, we can correct. And so we started to write our script up. This is a little example. We would talk to students about things that they think matter. So we wanted to answer all of those questions about voting, but then also talk about, here's how you dissect your ballot. It was one of the longest ballots in Arizona state history this last election. There were 13 ballot propositions and it was over 4 pages long. A lot of students, when we get in the classroom, will say like, hey, who feels overwhelmed? And the hands would go up and we'd say like, I know you must be bombarded by so much information. I don't know if it's accurate or how to pick through what's real or not. And so we'll talk to them about finding good faith information in a nonpartisan way, how to follow the money behind things that you'll see on your ballot. Then we'll also answer common scary questions, like giving students time to be like, hey, I live in Tempe, but I go to school in Arizona, like in Northern Arizona. Can I vote? And answering those one-on-one questions really was super helpful. We would also talk about how to navigate the registration process. In Arizona, the law shifted. So if you don't have an Arizona state ID or driver's license, you submit a voter registration form, they'll discard it and never notify you. So you'll think that you're registered and you'll never actually get registered. So we're helping check student voter registration. A couple other things that we also thought were very important is we'd emphasize in our presentations that civic engagement is super expansive and it's not just voting. So a lot of DACA recipients are in Arizona that can't vote. A lot of international students, we'd say you can still be involved in the civic process, even if you're not voting. And I know a lot of the focus is on students that can vote right now. So we made a point to do that. In these presentations, one of my favorite things that we did is we hammered home that NSOLV data that Mike mentioned. We'd say, hey, in this engineering class, your peers only vote 20% of you voted in the last election. And we wanted to say that's not your fault. This information is given as a privilege to majors that have to interact with it every day. So we'll take the blame out of that and we'll just give empowering information, which is my favorite part. We also talk about some different reasons why students might be hesitant to vote. We'd say, hey, who got those texts threatening to tell people that you voted? And students' hands would go up. And we'd say, hey, nobody actually knows who you voted for. That's private. Like you deserve to keep that information private. You don't have to fill out everything on your ballot, even though we recommend it. We would just go through these things that might have prevented students from casting a ballot, like whether it be fear or a lack of information. And we try to level set with them to like, let them know what's true and not. How we start the presentations too is we say, I don't care who you vote for or how you vote, I will never know. We just want to give you good information. And students responded really well. The biggest thing that we saw a positive response to when we're doing this work is we mentioned the barriers you face as a student voting and using that as a reason to tell folks to vote. And we saw turnout actually increase because of that from the students that we worked with. We'd say, hey, all of these laws that we just went through, all of these changes in registration and turnout, that is why you should vote. If your vote didn't matter, folks wouldn't make it their work to create tough voting laws. So you need to vote out of spite. And that was the most response we got from any students in the state of Arizona, was saying like, yes, I am going to vote now because it is hard. And so that's kind of something that we learned is really important. And then we'll move on. No, you're great. The response is overwhelming, even though we did not get the same quantitative data that my team got. We collected 790 cards. We talked to 66 classrooms. We talked to thousands of students in the state of Arizona. One student came up to me afterwards and said, that came on election day to the polls, said, you came to my computer engineering class And that's why I'm here voting today. Nobody's ever talked to me about civic engagement in any of my classes because I am a STEM student. And so we checked his registration and we got him out to vote. Another student said, I wasn't going to vote until we talked about voting out of spite. And I saw them at the polls on election day. And they said, yeah, it is hard as a STEM student. This is why I'm going to vote. One of the instructors, after I had said my whole spiel, came up to me and said, I had no idea how hard it was to be a voter in Arizona. Like, just talking about how difficult it is for students to navigate. That's what makes this work really important. The qualitative data, the conversations we had with students made me know that, like, going into these classrooms, you're making a real difference, and students knowing that their faculty members care enough to talk to them about this stuff really helps hammer it home. Another way this can impact folks is if they're in an, let's say you're a first-time college student, you just left home and your folks have never talked to you about voting before, having somebody that's a friendly face with no agenda come talk to you about voting really helps you feel empowered. I had one community college student come up to me afterwards and say, my parents told me I'm not allowed to register to vote. They don't want me engaging with the political process. Will you walk me through it? Like, I am an adult, I want to work through. So you might be like doing these presentations or participating in this research the first time anybody's ever cared enough to talk to you about voting. And that makes a really huge difference. This is an email that we got afterwards too. We didn't just work with STEM students, we worked with students in the fine arts because they also have a lower voter turnout at this specific school. One student, this professor opened up their entire class period to us, and we were able to answer every student's questions individually, talk about why voting matters, go through language on ballot propositions in a nonpartisan way. A student took his time to email me separately and say, thank you for coming. And he said, that's why, like, myself and a lot of our peers voted. Like, these students, when I go in and talk to the classrooms, I'll leave my phone number and I'll say, you call me if you have any questions about voter registration. And they'll call and say, like, walk me through the process again. Here's my situation. Can you help? And it really did make a difference. And so I think these quotes and this example are just like reasons why taking dedicated time in the classrooms, letting your students know that you care whether they vote, and then presenting this good faith information really makes all the difference. And then to wrap it up, what we learned, dedicated time really makes all the difference when it comes to student engagement. Asking students individually if they felt confused or intimidated and using that information to build your presentations was the most helpful. And then staying afterwards to create space for students to come up and ask those one-on-one questions, because you might be the first person that they've ever talked to you about this stuff. So even if you said it in your presentation, like giving them the chance to be like, here's my situation, fix it for me. And then we can walk them through the process and it feels really good. And then finally, this will be super important moving forward as more states adopt complicated and confusing voter registration laws. So in Arizona, we're the only state that has a documentary proof of citizenship and proof of residency law. So that means when you go to register to vote, you have to present your passport or birth certificate if you don't have a state ID number. You have to submit that in person with your voter registration form. They'll verify that. Then you have to wait and mail in either your utility bill or a piece of official election mail or your voter registration card back to them to prove that you're a resident. If you're a first-time voter and let's say you don't drive or you're from out of state, you're never going to complete that process unless somebody is there to walk you through it, to help you and to let you know those things. We anticipate a lot more states adopting policies like this when it comes to voter registration. Having somebody that's trustworthy and patient and in classrooms so students know it's legit to walk them through this process is going to be so important in making sure folks feel empowered in the next election. Because I know y'all have probably seen folks in your own campus doing third-party voter registration. You don't know if those forms are getting turned in. And likely you're not taking the same amount of time to verify that everything is correct and to get those documents. So having this in the classroom, students will be able to check if they're registered, go through the process, ask questions, and know that their information is being handled in a delicate way. Because when you have to deal with your passport or your birth certificate or your utility bill, you want someone that you can trust to do it. And so getting institutional support in your faculty members saying, I believe in these folks, I know it'll go through, will help folks feel empowered about the whole process. Thank you. And I'll pass it back over to Mike.
So the last step is we just want to kind of pose some research questions on some things that we're thinking about, but I actually just want to revisit sort of something that Emma mentioned. I think one other area that we've seen an explosion of, as Mike mentioned this, is just restrictive voting laws targeting students. And so I would love to explore, like, how are those impacting the process? And is that having a statistical sort of impact on who was able to participate? Because I think something like that could be really useful in the court system. If we could come back and show research that shows that these type of restricted laws are negatively impacting somebody's ability to sort of turn out. And so I know there's been a lot of work done on the voter ID side with that, but I think we're seeing more and more laws targeting specifically college students. It'd be interesting to look at kind of those sorts of components too, to sort of demonstrate that it is having that sort of negative impact. Now, coming back to the idea of sort of the class wrap strategy, here's kind of 4 research questions that we're sort of would love to explore around, does the sort of presenter impact make a difference in terms of somebody's likelihood for voting? And so sometimes I will come in and do these presentations. Many times we'll have students, but like, the type of charisma or energy that they bring in the room, does that have an impact or doesn't it matter at all? Then thinking about sort of the content balance around this. So you heard Emma, like in Arizona, because all the restrictive laws, they have to do a lot of logistical things and providing those sort of basic information. In Minnesota, I don't have to do that. It's more just like why you should vote. And that's where I focus my time. And so it would be interesting to explore is like, do students need both, or does it depend upon the location? Because there's, I think, a lot to look at sort of where you're doing this too, that we might get different results in some of these sort of research questions. Then also just thinking about, how you tailor this for a particular campus or sort of culture then too. Do you need to have some of that context to sort of impact the effectiveness? One way that I often did it in Minnesota is I would ask students who here feels they pay too little for their education. So it's kind of a unique way to get at basically college affordability. And I talk about how some elected officials think you pay too little. In fact, they want to raise your tuition next semester. And so this election is an opportunity to send them a message that we need to make college more affordable, not less. So does that type of sort of very specific college affordability message work? And does it work across sort of states, or is that only a Minnesota thing that sort of works there? And I think sort of that messaging and that contextual relevance can be really important. And then also thinking about just the implementation strategies then too. So I'm very insistent that like you pass out the forms to every single person. That creates sort of a herd effect where students feel the peer pressure to sort of fill out the forms. Is my hypothesis correct? Is that actually driving up turnout sort of by doing that and using that herd mentality, or should we doing it a separate way, or having enough faculty do a message at the end of this to kind of put a little bit more pressure? Does that sort of add to it? So I think there's all these different things of whether it's presenter, content, the context, or implementation that we'd love to explore on sort of the effectiveness. And then our hope is to really sort of expand this type of program across the country to then help us hit that goal of full voter participation in young people. And our hope is that that will then fundamentally change our politics then in the United States. So with that, happy to open up to questions, thoughts around some of the research questions, and kind of go from there.
It's great. Well, first, let's thank all the speakers. It's amazing what you're all doing. I mean, it's really, yeah, so impressive. And let's see, well, let me ask I have a lot of questions, but I'll let you, the others in the room, I don't want to block the time, so go ahead with the other part.
Approach towards mobility and the other does it change pre-election and post-election in terms of the mentality as to how you should have approached? Does the results in any way affect your approach, or is that are you completely agnostic with respect to whatever the results we have? Like what is the parameter for success? Or is it completely agnostic with respect to the results of the election?
So most of us are C3 organizations. So from that lens, that's sort of a legal tax code. So with that, we have to be agnostic. I would say post-election, we have looked at is just concerns about sort of the voting rate that I don't think was as high as we would like. Particularly, we see that sort of step down from the 2020 election when it was in the 60s, and now it went down to 53, 55. So I want to kind of understand sort of why. And some of that is stuff beyond our control. It could be candidates particular. And so this particular strategy could be facing what we call a headwind if you have candidates that sort of particularly don't aren't relevant to young people in particular. So I think we're taking the outcome base is sort of agnostic, but in terms of the results and how many young people we're looking at, we're trying to understand sort of how does that impact this strategy going forward, and does that create sort of more challenges for us as an externality that we can't control.
Or do you have the creation of apps to type that are engagement that has to be careful
Yes, it does. I think that is up for debate on whether that is completely agnostic. I see it as agnostic because I'm not saying vote for a Democrat or vote for a Republican. And so I'm taking the issue, and that issue could be supported by either political party. And I would argue, you could sort of make an assumption that Democrats support higher education, Republicans oppose higher education. I would push back on that sort of assumption, because I think we see Republicans will often support programs like financial aid and sort of others. And so that's where I kind of see it agnostic, where the outcome is unclear. And I'm challenging the young people to do their own research on that, to figure out which person they think sort of answers the question to their liking on it. I would say yes. I mean, how do you think that would play? You chose intentionally not to use that strategy in Arizona,
Yes.
because of concerns with how it would be perceived.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, I think just like we said before, there's like the hard letter of the law and what is allowed, and then the climate that it's operating in and what people are comfortable with. I feel like generally speaking, you can talk about issues, especially if you're not directly connecting them to candidates, like you're not doing a candidate support party, even you're just talking about like, if this issue is important to you, like one of the things we will do is like, we'll ask people like what issue, one of our other favorite games is like, is that on the ballot? And we'll ask people what issues are important to them. And then depending on what they say, we'll talk about different levels of office and the impact that they might have on that. So like, if you're in a nursing program and you care about public health, like who are the people that are making those types of decisions that might be at the state or local level? Or if transportation is your number one issue, like, do you know that the like city council here determines like the bus rates and how much funding they get? So like tying issues to even like elected offices, like is something we'll do. But lots of times then we're not talking to folks about even the candidates that are running for that office or their positions on that. We're talking about like just who makes those decisions, so that folks can then determine where they need to understand those candidates' position on that issue, if that's what's important to them.
And in Arizona too, we would do, instead of like asking a question like that, we'd tailor it a bit more to the individual classes. And so if you were a construction management student, instead of asking that, I'd be like, hey, even if you're feeling not enthusiastic about bigger elections, your county assessor determines how construction management companies operate Flagstaff. Or if you're an environmental student, your corporation commission determines your utilities and your water. Or I'll talk about the water board. So I'll pick out something down ballot that pertains to their major to say, like, even if you don't care nationally or you're not satisfied with presidential candidates or whatever, this race is tucked at the bottom that pertains to your major. Or if you care about public health, here's what's on the ballot that's pertinent. And then that'll help kind of like make that connection without being partisan, because we did have to be a little bit closer to the closer when we talked about that stuff.
Yeah, to play devil's advocate, I do feel that question is a little partisan. I think the way you were framing it, I like it way better when it's like this issue exists. And here, you can vote on this item.
Yeah.
That's the item that pertains to the issue. And like sort of stop it there. I think the way the question comes across is really implying what your position is on the issue. And so that feels like you are in a certain way forming one position.
Mhm.
I guess then it becomes on like, you're not exactly tying it to a party, but people could research and tie to a party. So I don't know how like a Colorado would see it,
Mhm.
but I think we're more on the edge of that. And then the other question I had was, well, first of all, I thank you for the way you're doing, but the other thing was, I think part of why the turnout is low is also for some people don't really care that much.
Mhm.
So are there any initiatives that are like, maybe not directly tied into people voting, but just like making politics more interesting for like someone my age? And like just trying to let people that be more involved, just be interested and see if that would like them like participating.
To me, that comes back to the civic education piece. I think one of the struggles why people feel government doesn't necessarily impact them is because they don't understand necessarily the process. And so the more we can help sort of demystify that, and sort of use these spaces, particularly with faculty, that can help them understand the context and why politics is embedded, and no matter what you do, whether it's public health or construction, I think drawing that connection can be really important. And then allowing people to find their own identity around this and then voice around that. So I think particularly young people, as they're turning 18, we don't magically put pixie dust over them and they become civically engaged. It has to be a learned activity. And so how do we leverage the classroom to sort of build that in? And I would argue with many higher ed institutions, it's within our missions to do exactly that. I mean, higher education was originally created to sort of develop people to become citizens. That was the primary purpose. And now it's become very much a workforce issue. And that's still important, but I think we need to go back to sort of some of the foundational levels. And I think even your president here at Johns Hopkins has talked about that as sort of creating citizens in sort of a broad, not a legal definition of citizens, but a broadly sort of citizen of the world, effectively engaged, that is sort of a mission that we all need to really sort of engage in. I think if we were to come back to that as higher ed institutions, I think figuring out how we embed them in the curriculum is really critical. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think the civic education piece plays a really huge role. I know I touched on it before when I was a democracy fellow. We were working on different campuses on how to get students engaged with this information. So sometimes we do presentations in different student organizations, or we just do small groups and tabling and just get people involved when there's a lot of people on campus. And those are ways that we've seen that small, like one-on-one interactions tend to really get people interested. But yeah, I think that's really what's helped, like the other audience.
And then when I am doing this work, like I'll kind of touch on like I graduated undergrad last year, like a year and a half ago. So I feel the same way. And I'll tell that to classrooms. I'll say, I feel it's hard to care. And so that's how I'll start these conversations. I'll say like, but what motivates me is I look down ballot and I'll say like, hey, like, what do you care about like in your life? And they'll say, I care about healthcare. And then I'll like go to the ballot and I'll pick out one proposition that pertains to healthcare. And I was like, even if you vote for it, you could ignore everything else and just vote for what you care about. So if you are concerned about judges in Arizona, like just vote for them and like you can still have your say. So that's helpful when you tell people like you're not responsible for the whole ballot. You can only do what you care about. And then talking about like it is hard, so you should do it. Like your voice is threatening as a student, and there's so much oppression towards student voters that should like helps me feel a little bit better, because in an environment where it's really difficult to cast a ballot or register as a student or a young person, your vote can also be an act of protest against that and saying like, hey, this is hard and it sucks and it shouldn't, it should be empowering. And so that's why I vote anyways, and just kind of level setting and not, I feel like when you're talking about vote work, a lot of folks will be demeaning to young people or act like you should know something or act like you should care. And so I try not to do that. I'll be like, I also think this is a non-exciting environment where folks talk down to you because you're a young person and folks tell you should vote one way or another. But like, I will help you do the research. We'll look into the finances and like, you can take it back and not be told what to do. So I'll try to like, that's how I'll market it.
Yeah. Oh, I just was gonna add quickly, we don't have time for like a full like political philosophy class today, but I would say like one of the reasons I keep doing this work and one of the things that we'll start doing even next like in the spring semester around like the legislative session is that like I think we have a lot of structural deficiencies in how our democracy operates. Like having a two-party winner take all first past the post election system predominate, especially for our federal elections, creates a lot of like basically I think a lot of people don't feel like they can engage or they have to pick a party, and the parties are very polarized and opposite. And that drives a lot of people out of the conversation. And to be frank, like there are people, it is an intentional strategy that some people are engaging in to make politics feel very divisive and crappy because they want fewer people to participate. And that's the outcome they're trying to get. So I think like there's really big headwinds against us when we think about like how do we do this, and when we see these dis and misinformation campaigns, when we see people, the ability to like micro target people and to do it like online and with the internet and in the online spaces they hang out in. Like now, not only is that meaning that like most campaigns are putting out a million different messages in an election cycle now in a presidential race, where they used to just be like, here are my 3 big issues and here are my 3 big ads, and I'm trying to talk to as many people as possible. Now they're saying those things, and the money in it is very elusive, and it's gotten outside of the spotlight as well, which means you can have people be trying to use wedged issues in a community to split them off and dissuade them from participating. We've seen that for a couple of election cycles now, and I think that's only going to get worse if we don't do something about it. So I feel like there's you know, we do this work every election cycle because there are young people who we need to try and bring into the process every election cycle. But like we also run a program where we talk about like the history of voting rights in this country. And I spend a little bit of time every semester trying to convince, 300 young people that like the electoral college sucks and we should get rid of it. And I'm just trying to like slowly radicalize enough people that maybe like in my lifetime will see that opinion like spread further. So I think there's like some much longer term and bigger picture things that we would need to do to have a more engaged democracy that's actually responsive to the people that you choose to participate. That was longer than. It's
that's
hard
great.
once they
And,
start railing against things.
It's good. I mean, it's great, actually. So that I'll just add that I really like the question about, why, how do you get people motivated? I mean, it would apply to every age, I think. But the school of public health where we are, I mean, there are a lot of ways that it touches the political system. So, for example, faculty will go and testify in front of the state legislature. I mean, some faculty have gone in for testified before US Congress also on different public health issues. So that's pretty common for people to do. So that's one way faculty are involved. And I don't know if students, but I mean, that's something we could try to pull students into, or at least have them know about. But I guess in my thinking, and again, I'm no expert on this, but that voting and elections are the tip of the iceberg in terms of politics, and there's just all this under stuff, and there's many opportunities to be involved. And a lot of it connected to, since we're in the school of public health, there's a lot connected to public health as well. So it is something, it's a good idea to think about, well, how to help students get engaged, in a nonpartisan way, but in advancing public health, for example.
And I think the question is that actually an inverted pyramid? And so is elections kind of the start of that civic journey, or is it the end? And so
That's a good.
trying to navigate that piece, I think, is just an interesting conversation. Or is it not linear at all? And so is there just multiple ways? But I think what we've seen with some student engagement is often that is the tip, and how people, it's that inverted pyramid. If you get somebody to do that, then they're more likely to do other civic activities.
That makes a lot of sense. And it does bring me to my question about research design and analysis for some of these questions, and thinking about what do you, well, I'm curious what's possible in terms of the kind of interventions you're doing. Could you randomize? I mean, being someone who does design and analysis of experiments, randomization, we always prefer if possible. So randomizing the different things that you had in terms of types of presentation or people who are doing the presentations, and doing it in a way where you could simultaneously answer a lot of those questions, especially if you can do it at a large scale. I mean, that's like the dream, to do a big national experiment where you're trying these different things to see which is most effective and what. Yeah.
So is it possible? Yes. Is it easy? No. I mean, because it just requires a level of sophistication, sort of on the back end. And so I think you'd first probably get the list of all the classrooms, you'd randomize that then, and then from there you would do your controlled experiments into those. I think the challenge is just your first step in between there is then engaging the faculty and realizing that not every faculty that you are in your experiment are going to say yes. And so how do you sort of navigate that particular piece? And then from there, you can go with the different interventions and the different styles. And that just requires then different training with the students. I would almost run 2 simultaneous campaigns and sort of have them know that each other exists, but like have them kind of focus on this group is just focused on this intervention. This group is just focused on this intervention. And then obviously you have your placebo group.
I like that. And I mean, you could imagine something, I mean, the ideal, I think, would be something where you have multiple interventions at the same place, the same institution, and some faculty get randomly assigned to the 5-minute intervention, some get the 15-minute or things like that. It also could just be randomized the university. If you can get hundreds of universities, and I think maybe you already do, but and colleges, and you can just randomize each of those to get a certain type. That also, I mean, so I think there's a lot of possibility. And no experiment is perfect, so it doesn't have to, and it'll be fine that many or most even faculty will not do it. That's still fine. You can still, but one thing I was curious about is, personally, is how to get more faculty to know about this. I mean, that's something I'm, as a faculty person, trying to engage more faculty here at Hopkins and also outside of Hopkins to do this. I mean, it's just such a, I just think about it as just a really valuable thing to provide to students, that, and the fact that it's available. I mean, as faculty person, the main constraints I have are time, essentially, that if you ask me, well, will you do something new in your class and you have to design it and do a bunch of work to prepare it, I would say, let me think about it, but I probably wouldn't do it. But it would depend what it is. But if you say, can someone come in and talk for 5 minutes and I don't have to do anything, then they can just do it all. And that's a much lower ask. I mean, it's almost, you can see it as helping. It's like, all right, you're going to use 5 minutes for something interesting. Students might get more focused because it's something out of the ordinary of class. So it's, so I think the ask is very small of faculty, but it's like, how do you convince faculty that this is completely fine? I mean, I'll just tell anecdotally that when I asked the faculty, in different institutions, that none of this is relevant to Hopkins, but sometimes they were worried about, will this be okay? Will I get in trouble? Some were, most people didn't ask that at all, but they were fine just to do it. But some, depending on where they were like, you know, so being able to overcome or at least talk about that with people. And also just another question is, would it be of interest to try different interventions to try to pull in faculty? So different approaches. I mean, I think you have a pretty amazing approach of where you've got like 1,000 faculty or something like that.
Yeah.
Out of, I mean, a huge number. Like that. Yeah. How to do that at many universities at once would be amazing. And maybe just trying different techniques. So like, what can faculty do to get other faculty to pull them into this? Yeah.
For me, it's we've been able to go deep at the University of Minnesota because we have a key partner there who sort of has some of the relationships. So I think in order for us to go deep like that, you'd have to sort of work with one faculty member to kind of be that sort of beachhead, essentially, to then sort of branch out, work with either the administration, campus administration, or where I've actually found a lot of success is working through student government leadership. And sort of having, because again, the basis of this is doing this peer-to-peer approach.
Yeah.
So if you engage the student government and have them kind of own this, then that sort of, they can make the request of administration. And oftentimes administration will say yes to them on this type of piece. Because the key component is then making the request to the IT department to literally get the list of the faculty. So we get this giant list of the faculty and when all the classes are meeting. And then we use that to then send out the invitations to the faculty saying, we'd like to come to your public health 101 class meeting on Monday, November 18th at 1 p.m. And so it's that level of customization, but we have that backend data that allows us to get such a high sort of return rate on it. And so the key thing is if you get that list, that's sort of step one. Then step two is having the volunteer or paid sort of student base to be able to implement or carry out all those. Because again, doing 1,000 classrooms is not an easy undertaking. And so we required 40 students. We paid them to do that. I think roughly we invested about $25,000 in paying students to do that through kind of a semester sort of time period. And so then that would be a secondary component is, all right, do we then have to raise the money to do that sort of per institution? I think you can do what you did with SAM, which was kind of a more sort of scattershot approach. It probably doesn't have the impact, but that is a resource light sort of action with it. And so I think just navigating that is sort of also an option. Or I think what we've looked at too is can you present them with a video that then could work for, and I would not do a national video, I would do a statewide video because each state's election laws are different, that it has to be customized. And so do you do a video per state that could essentially get shared and sort of get replicated? I think that's less effective than a live student coming in, but it is a resource light sort of way to do it.
I mean, just my personal take is I really like that having a person come in, and especially if it's just another student. Yeah, I mean, that's just, you know, I think it's going to be much more interesting to see another student talk than to see the faculty person talk like they usually do. So that I think would just be more interesting. So I think that's definitely the way to go, but yeah, it's true, sometimes you can't reach certain places, so. Yeah, so I'm excited to talk about ideas for how to, yeah, how to design experiments or analyze data or anything that could be helpful for just, yeah, increasing voter turnout and registration. I think it's just such an amazing goal. And you all found this super effective way to do it based on the randomized experiment data and results. So yeah, it's fantastic. Do you all have any ideas on what could be helpful from, say you had unlimited access, or like all the people in this room would be willing to spend a lot of time to work on stuff for you? I mean, I can't volunteer their time, but the I mean, I sort of not the I can't, but if you, what would you want the statisticians or data type people to do? Like, what would you want?
I think step one would be to recreate the Benton study that I sort of talked about. And that study specifically focused on whether it made a difference between faculty and student classroom visits. And so I would want to focus on, let's just do students because we know that's more effective. So come in with students and sort of recreate that. Again, that was done in 2006. It was done for multiple states. So I think I was sort of looking at that, and then it maybe would like to do sort of a compare it to, does a 5 minute matter versus a either 20 or 55 minute sort of scenario of that, and sort of look at sort of the difference in that. So that would be, I think, step number one. And then I think step number two to look at is just, could we get into the nuance of what the message is and how much does that impact? My only worry with that is I think that changes so much over time.
Yeah.
And so I think that's really tough to sort of analyze. And yes, you may find something that works in 2025, but is that going to work in 2026? And so I think, the message piece, I think, is a little bit more challenging, but I like the sort of brief versus sort of more in-depth piece. And then also, does that vary between a state like Minnesota and then Arizona? So does that depth really need to work in states that have really high administrative burdens for voter registration, voter engagement? And does a short one work better than in some of the states that don't have those type of barriers then too? Great, thank you. Any other thoughts about?
I think like the most helpful thing for my curiosity when it comes to research would be to your question, is talking to young people about what messaging works and what would make you care, and how do we tailor this to that? Because I feel like all of these presentations and when you talk about big voting initiatives, you never see it be young people designing them. It is the same things that have worked for years and years and years, whether it be political parties or nonpartisan organizations. We're tabling and we're using the same talking points and we're running campaigns the same way. So I'd be super interested in knowing what college students right now think worked, what they think didn't, and how their universities could better serve them to be voters. Because when we've started interviewing students at NAU, U of A, and ASU in Arizona, and say tell us what your university did for you to help with voting, and tell us how you think they failed and what you would have liked to see. And we have a giant list of those things compiled so far. So I'd love to see that nationwide, is what students actually think you need and how you'd want to be spoken to in a classroom. Because I feel like the only people that can tell you that are your target audience. And I feel like that's who you interact with the least when you're doing research. So that would be my dream.
Okay, great.
I'm gonna echo that. Absolutely. I think that would be really insightful to know. And then I think one thing in particular I'd be interested in, just because primaries tend to have so much less of a turnout, I'd be interested in what strategies keep that light bulb on for students, and then what can keep that light bulb engaged and keep them engaged with primaries as well.
That's a really good point, especially in Baltimore City. I mean, it's because of just the political landscape. It's so much is happening in the primary, but it's hard to know about, or it's doesn't get as much focus, I guess, in news media about what's happening. So that's always it. Yeah.
I think that's good. Sweet.
Perfect. Great.
Yeah.
Well, why don't we end here? Let's thank the speakers
Absolutely.
again.
Thank you.
Fantastic.